In this episode, let's have a look at a variable ND filter from Aurora Aperture. So what's the purpose of an ND filter? For shooting video, the purpose is to allow you to block some light from getting into your camera so that you can get the look that you want. And you might ask, well, can't you just use the camera settings for that? So 3 major exposure settings on cameras are going to be shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. Now, when you're shooting video, pretty much your shutter speed is fixed. So if you're shooting 24 frames per second video, you're probably going to want your shutter speed set to 1/50th of a second just to get kind of a normal look, or you might tweak it a little bit, but typically you're not going to stray a whole lot from that. Next, ISO only goes so low in every camera. In my Panasonic GH4, for example, it goes down to ISO 200. Once you hit 200, you can't go any lower. You can't make the sensor any less sensitive to light. And then that leaves the aperture. The aperture is the little hole that opens or closes to let more or less light in. And when you close it down, a higher number, you let less light in. But the problem with that is that you also get more in focus. So if you're trying to shoot a scene outdoors in bright sunlight where you want your subject in focus, but you want to blur the background, you can't really do that because you have to use a really, really small aperture to prevent so much light from coming in to get the proper exposure. And that is exactly where a neutral density filter comes in. Okay, so then why do you need a variable ND filter? Well, the nice thing about a variable ND filter is it allows you to dial in exactly how much light you want to cut to get exactly the look you want. For example, I have a very, very nice fixed B+W neutral density filter. It's a beautiful filter, very well constructed. The optics are fantastic. The problem is that it's fixed at 6 stops. So if I put that on my lens, I still have to tweak my camera settings to get the exposure just right, depending on the lighting. So the problem with that is that I can't always use it because it may not get me in the right ballpark. Chen, who is the founder of Aurora Aperture, is a photographer and an engineer, and he set out to design the most powerful neutral density filter on the market. And that's what we have here with the Power XND 2000. This filter claims to be able to reduce light by 11 stops. That is huge. So Chen contacted me. He said he'd done a number of tests and there's been a number of reviews by photographers and wanted to see if a videographer could also take a look at it. So he sent this to me. Full disclaimer, I did not pay for it with my own money. What's a stop of light? Each stop allows in half the amount of light that the previous stop allows. So for example, f4 allows in half the amount of light that f2.8 allows in. So here's a practical example. In this scene, I set the shutter speed to a normal speed for 24 frames per second video, which is 1/50th of a second. I set the ISO to 200, which is as low as it can go on this particular camera, Panasonic GH4. But then, to get the exposure right, I had to set the aperture to f22. That's the lens's smallest aperture. And when I do that, everything is in focus, including the background, which I would prefer to have out of focus. And that out of focus look is a really useful look when you want to draw attention to your subject. This is a really powerful tool of visual storytelling. And this is what the same shot looks like with the variable ND set to just over halfway. All the settings are the same except that I was able to open the aperture to f2.8. And the result is that the background blurs nicely. This draws attention away from the distracting background and towards the subject. So the variable ND allowed me to open up my aperture by 6 stops. That's huge. And because I was able to open up like that, we were able to blur the background nicely. Now, most variable NDs will only allow you to do a total of 6 stops, so that's where this one's a little bit unique, and this one's operating well within its limits, so usually that's preferable when you're working with something and you take it all the way to its limit. Sometimes the quality suffers a little bit. In this case, it seems to hold up very nicely. The filter frame is 5.5 millimeters thick. This is important because some variable ND filters are thicker, which tends to create vignetting on wide lenses. This means you get dark edges around the frame of your video. Usually, you want to avoid that. Another trick that comes along with the ND filters is that sometimes they introduce color casts. I shot a color chart here, both with and without the ND filter, just to see if there was any difference, and to my eye, I'm not seeing a difference on the color chips. Then in terms of skin tones, if we look in here really closely, this is actually a typical response for my skin tone with or without this variable ND filter. So again, it doesn't seem to impose any sort of color cast, which is really, really important. Also, it doesn't appear to affect the sharpness of the image at all, which is sometimes an issue with some of the variable ND filters out on the market. So really high quality from that standpoint as well. Another common issue is that some variable ND filters will create this cross pattern at certain settings. And that has to do with a lot of things like the angle at which the light is coming into the variable ND filter and things of that nature. It's an awful look. It destroys your footage if you happen to have that issue on your particular variable ND. On this one, I was not able to reproduce that, so it looks like it's going to work pretty nicely. In terms of technique, I did learn one thing. You'll want to set the white balance of your camera before you put the variable ND on it. And by that, I mean you're probably not going to want to use auto white balance because that can actually throw things off when it's coming in through the variable ND filter. Not sure why that is, but I found that if I set the white balance first and then put the variable ND on, by setting the white balance, I mean setting it to one of the presets like daylight, fluorescent, whatever it may be in your particular case, or a custom white balance, it seemed to do really, really well. If you left it on auto white balance, it could start to do some funny things in terms of color. So there's a look at the Aurora Aperture Power XND 2000. I hope that was helpful for you. If you have any questions, go ahead and leave those down below. And if you've not already subscribed, make sure you do that, and we'll be sure to get you more great videos on how to improve your lighting and sound for video. Talk to you soon.